Hi, everyone. Welcome to our last week of content. And in this week, I'm going to get into I'm really going to go against the grain of the main article that we had to read, the idea of monitory democracy. But I think the larger point that I want to make is I want you to pay attention to how, through a conceptual framework, a conceptual framework can be linked to a case study. So I'm going to be using Spain as a case study for the idea of sort of challenging monetary democracy and accountability. And I'm using Spain really because it's the example that I'm the most acquainted with, and that's really at the gist of this conversation, because in the end, the main problem that I see with Flinders' article, that he being Daniel, and the Daniel's metaphor, is that it lacks a specificity. And when it comes to democracy, political systems, really the devil is in the detail. And do not get me wrong, I think Flinders and academics like him should be applauded for trying to challenge commonplaces in academia, and for trying to have a larger conversation. And I think there is a lot of validity in some of the arguments that he makes, especially when he is thinking about how academics discourses are getting more and more specific, and that is that more and more academics know a lot about less, and that they're disengaged with public discourse. And this idea of too much accountability can be bad for democracy, it's certainly within the public political discourse of the last 10 years, right? And the whole article really can be summed up into what I have here, this first point, which is, again, making politicians accountable, or to accountables, having them go through all these different procedures of accountability. In the end, it's bad for democracy because it lends itself for a type of politics that are mostly attack politics, that gotcha moment. And that is what erodes public trust. Now, I'm going to push back against that argument at a first level. And the first level is that I think Flinders is assuming the homogeneity of democratic systems. That is, that all democratic systems are more or less the same, thinking that liberal democracy and the procedures of liberal democracy works, within quotation marks, in very similar ways, historically and contextually, right? And in that way, he suffers from Anglocentrism and his own idea of liberal democracy within the Anglosphere. That is the British American model of democracy, which is very different if you go to other just go to Southern Europe, and Spain will be that perfect example, right? And also at the same time, there is another level which has to do with the transnational myopia that I think he has, because really when it comes to international law, democratic systems of all types and all colors and all ideological persuasions are mostly left unaccountable. And there are all types of undemocratic interventions throughout history, but we can just take the last 20 years. And those undemocratic interventions at a transnational level are never accounted for. And you can think here of the different type of even military interventions in Latin America, in the Middle East, Central Africa, just Haiti is having a military intervention, or at least there's the beginning of a military intervention that is directly supported by the US. But then the case of Russia and the geopolitical tensions between Russia and the US, China and Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the different geopolitical context of those interventions. And those are certainly undemocratic interventions. So those are never accounted for, and we don't have, and there's, if anything, there's a lack of accountability. And this is beyond beyond the idea of who is to blame for the intervention. So remember that that's besides the point. The point here is that there is a complete lack of accountability when it comes to the international and transnational arena. And the third one in here is that I think it's totally unconvincing, even within democratic systems and even within the Anglosphere, not to mention other non-Anglospheres. You know, Spain will be that example. When it comes to structural issues, political systems are never held accountable for their direct participation in structural inequalities. Think about the role of governments in promoting racism or in promoting gender discrimination or human rights violation. In the case of Spain, you can see how even state sponsored terrorism was mostly unaccounted. No, it wasn't accounted for at the international level, nor at the domestic level. So there's a total lack of accountability whenever you start getting into the nitty gritty of how democracy works, right? So I think, again, the issue really, the problem is that it's a non-issue. Although it points at an important public discourse around the role of the media and political accountability. And in here, media, we can talk about traditional media, but we can also talk about social media. And I'm going to stick to traditional media because I think social media tends to be a little too messy. But when it comes to media, the main criticism that I have is that really the role of the media, as we understand it historically, is not one of holding power to account, but of the proximity of the media and power structures. That is, the media has become, or was and is, another power structure that runs in parallel to political and economic structures, and is not really, or it's never really been part of civil society. And here, this is the fourth sphere, which I think is, and that we should be thinking of when it comes to accountability, and that's civil society. And that is the fourth structure that really is useful when thinking about political accountability. While the media, the economic sector, and the political establishment, those are vectors of power that sometimes overlap in the way they held each other accountable, but most of the time they run parallel to each other. That is, they are power structures in and of themselves. On top of that, when it comes to this idea that the media influence people, that they makes them believe, that certain politicians are corrupted while they're not, that they're over-influencing the public, there is a lack of empirical basis for this, because it's just simply really hard to find causation when it comes to the influence of the media on the public, on how the public is convinced of something like political corruption being rampant on a country. And the most that you can aspire to establish certain convincing correlations, and the correlations that Flinders establishes, to me, they're highly unconvincing. Because as Papadopoulos, in his critique of Flinders, argues, really, the media focus on front stage political theater, precisely because it is not only the most visible type of politics, is the one that the media has access to, while backstage political practices cannot really be accounted for. Think about dark money, poor barley, but think tanks, the influence of think tanks that we don't hear about, or whose stories are just plainly boring and do not make for good for good news article, right? And finally, in this aspect, regarding this aspect, I think what Flinders is not accounting for, and to me is one of the most important ones, is how culture as symbolic capital is really the grounding force of certain beliefs that later can be picked up by by politics, but by the media too, and it is that cultural environment that prepares for certain political belief that are later on seen in the media, and not the other way around. It's not the media creating the issues, but is the issue that lives within culture as symbolic capital that allows for those issues to be represented in the political discourse and within media discourses. And with that in mind, let's go to the case of Spain. And in the case of Spain, it's really important because when it comes to thinking of democracy, due to the history of Spain coming out of fascist dictatorship in 1975, the transition to democracy was held as an exemplary case, was thought as holding the right balance between political accountability of the past and creating a pathway for the future, right? However, when we start looking in depth about the processes of this type of accountability, what we see is a schism, a breach of representation at the highest level and at the lowest level. That is at the top and different type of power structures, whether are political, economic, and also mediatic, and at the bottom when it comes to civil society. There was a schism that was never really addressed, and then that somehow entered a law during the 80s all the way to the 90s and the early 2000s, and the main issues of the country were never really addressed. And then when we have the crisis in 2008, they come up. But one of the telltale signs of this, how this idea of too much accountability is bad for democracy, how that is not really true, or is not really a convincing argument, is precisely if you look at the peak of the country's source of economic corruption, which was the real estate boom, and how little accountability that was, you see how that lack of accountability led to this real estate boom, which was the source of the economic crisis, and how public trust went along with it. Right. So if public trust did not really affect the real issues of the problem, there was not a correlation between public trust and the economic corruptions in Spain. They were uncoupled. They were two different things, and they were not they were not together. And when we dig deeper into this issue, is when we start seeing how this idea of too much accountability is bad for democracy doesn't really make much sense as we enter the specificity of the issue, right? So in here you have some statistics that digs into what I'm saying, right? And you have foreign investment just booming in the 90s, early thousand, and then you have public trust also being quite high, especially when compared after the economic crisis. So it is really crisis and crisis of the system what creates public distrust, not so much accountability, right? And this is kind of my main point. Like, public trust and distrust has to do with structural issues around unaccountable problems, right? Problems that have been unaddressed for a long time. And Spain is that perfect example, precisely because it was held as sort of the pinnacle of liberal democracy working as it should in the 70s and the 80s, right? Especially when you think about the history of Spain coming out of a fascist dictatorship, right? So another aspect of this argument that I'm making here is that all these correlations do not really mean causation, and especially when it comes to the media, because if you think about how the media hold power to account, it was after civil society mobilized and after civil society was demanding accountability that you can see the media reflecting that type of accountability discourses and putting a lot of emphasis on political accountability, political corruption, economic accountability, right? So what that again means is that the symptoms of public distrust in democracy preceded media accountability, and actually were the trigger of that media accountability. And there were other signs that had nothing to do with the media. For instance, did hear this Ley Cinde, which was basically a sort of obscure copyright and intellectual property law that sparked a bunch of demonstrations around the idea of having and demanding a free internet, open and free internet. And there were massive demonstrations right before the big demonstrations of in May of 2011, which is the so-called 15M that I will get into it, which was the most visible public uproar, the most visible example of public distrust in democracy. And another strange symptom, that this is a little bit anecdotal, but I think it's really important precisely because I think culture, especially popular culture, is really it connects with a general feeling of public distrust at this moment, and is this blockbuster comedy Torrente 4 that became not only widely watched throughout Spain at the time and even internationally, and the whole basis or premise of the comedy was around the structural crisis of the country, and in a very kind of innocuous sort of like very unserious tone, but that it's another symptom of how there was already a cultural soup that allowed for this public distrust that sparked in May of 2011, that is triggered in May of 2011, right after the Arab Spring, right? And this is what I would call monitory civil society. And this is the fourth sphere that to me is the most important one, and that Flinders, for instance, is not really talking about. That is how democratic systems can empower civil society to hold to account different types of powers, whether political, economic, or even mediatic. And the Arab Spring in Tunisia and Egypt are that kind of examples of how lessons of civic duty came from the least expected places, especially if you think about how at that time, these Arab regimes were held as uncivil or illiberal democracies in which their society was held under the thumb of a dictator and could never really rebel or even ask for a true democracy, right? And then all of a sudden you have this outburst of civil society asking for democracy, and in fact, they topple governments, right? And the consequence of the immediate after effect of that explosion of civil society in throughout the Middle East and in Northern Africa is felt in Spain, right? And Spain start demanding the overhauling of the Spanish democratic system, something that was really left for radical leftist circles. It was never by any stretch of the imagination mainstream thought. It became completely mainstream, and therefore there was this slogan of real democracy now, which is pointing at a new type of accountability that comes from civil society and that is structured beyond the the media sectors, the political sector, or even the economic sector, right? So that's why we need to unpack this idea of monitoring and unpack public distrust, because public distrust here, it really has to do with the schism between these two spheres, one that is at the top and one that is at the bottom, between institutional politics, economic systems, and the media, and the kind of representations that you see in the media of what's important, what's not important, and people's everyday reality. And when you start looking at that, you start realizing that the main issue when it comes to this public distrust and these petitions of accountability has to do with how civil society perceives that has no control over their economic destiny, and how that economic and that loss of control of their economic future is completely related to the lack of accountability of the political system that the political system has over the economic sector, right? And the fact that this political system is basically unresponsive, yeah? So there's two further issues to discuss in here. One is then what is the role of the media? And the role of the media here is one of continued delegitimization. It's seen as delegitimized for different reasons, right? And I give you two reasons here. And that's something that we've talked before. This idea that then the media is not seen as a public service, but as a private for-profit company. The other one is that democracy, it's also perceived and seen as a procedure, as having elections every 4 years, but there is a structural lack of say or lack of consultation when it comes to the most important ones, which are in the end economic issues, right? We see the two-party system as having basically the same economic policy, and the only difference, and these tend to be exaggerated difference many times, are around social policies, but the economic structures stay the same, and that is what the real issue really when it comes to Spain, right? And I'm going to show you one final issue in here, and this is Christina Flesher from Inaya, who works on social movements, and she specifically worked on Spain, and how there is this permanent schism between representatives, and then here representatives are representatives in the political sphere, but also in the economy and in the media, and the represent. Right, and I'm just going to play 2 minutes of this clip, and I'll give you some final remarks.
And has the movement had any impact on the political scene in Spain?
Well, political scene, do you mean sort of the established political parties? To me, I don't really see that the established political parties responding in any real way or engaging in any real way with the demands of the citizens and of the protests. The Popular Party now is embroiled in election scandals, which have made the pages of UK press and US press around the world. They've leaked the fact that there are like separate ledgers that people have been paying extra salaries out of or double salaries out of. But really, the only way that I see that they've responded is with repression, increased repression, and unfortunately, when you have a global crisis, there are always people who are going to take advantage of that fact to try to dismantle the gains that have been over time. So we see a lot of attacks on labor laws or reforms of labor laws, some of which may, I don't know, I'm not an economist and I'm not an expert. It may be that some of that is necessary, but it's quite clear that in many cases it's a matter of really taking advantage of that situation to dismantle the social welfare system. So they're privatizing hospitals in Madrid, for example, which has long been a staple of one of the gains post-transition in Spain has been the creation of a really strong welfare state, and that's being dismantled now with this pretext of economic crisis and austerity.
And what is the current state now? Are there still protests ongoing? Do you foresee it continuing into the future?
Well, yeah, there are protests ongoing, but I think it's typical with cycles of contention that you see very visible mass protests that emerge, and then you see a sort of shift back to more local assemblies, local neighborhood activities, and so on. So it's really hard to predict when the next cycle will hit, but I think that people are still very active, and I'm sure that there will be more protest action in the future. I just couldn't tell you exactly when.
Dr. Flesher-Fuenaya, thank you.
Right. So in the end, the gist of this is that these systems of representation, whether a political, also economic, think that how economic life rules our everyday lives, mediatic, right? The media are taking advantage, in a very general way, thought in a very general way. When I say taking advantage, right, just so we understand each other, of the represented, and then the represented are asking for some type of accountability, which in the end means what they are really demanding is some type of control, specific control over the most important issues of their lives. One being economic, but also political, in the sense of having a political system that is responsive, and having a mediatic system that is equally responsive to popular demands, right? And that's the schism that we see, and that's why public distrust, in my opinion, and I think in many other scholars' opinions, takes place at large. And today, to this day, that breach of representation that was seen in the 15M in Spain, beyond this idea of monitory democracy, is very much unresolved, right? Even though, for instance, in 2014, we have new parties, the two-party system is over, and that opened a window of hope, but that was also a symptom that the country's main issues were still unresolved, right? So this ask for accountability, this public distrust is still ongoing. Now, what does the media do? Instead of diagnosing the root of the problem as a question of the relationship between civil society, accountability, and public distrust, they frame it as a malaise, as a disease of the political body that is fragmented, that needs to go back to the unity of the two-party system, right? Then they start using this idea of polarization, which is very frequent when you don't want to talk about root issues in politics. You start talking about polarization. It's sort of a sweeping word for basically political problems, undiagnosed political problems, structural problems, right? So instead of actually looking at how political solutions can address the fundamental flaws in Spain economic design, you talk about polarization and a climate of constant crisis instead of addressing the structural issue, right? Which has to do with the economic design of Spain, but also probably the UA, not probably for sure, the European Union design around the unequal redistribution of resources. So in the end, the result of this public distrust is not only public distrust, and this is the pandemic has revealed this uglier side in the Spanish political landscape, which is this widespread cynicism. Basically, all politicians are the same, and a type of political nihilism that you can see in the rise of the of Spanish far right, which is particularly nihilistic. So in the end, we need to go beyond not only monitory democracy, but beyond the way media frames democracy. The idea that there is a system that was working in the past, and that somehow it doesn't work now because of polarization. We have to move beyond that and start looking at how the system was unable to provide a stable future in the case of Spain, and how it was structurally designed not to provide that type of future, right? Okay, so we'll be going to discussions now, and I want you to get into discussions and try to be as specific as you can. I know that it's difficult, but try to think about very specific examples.